On the morning of May 24th, 2004, an engineering consulting firm in Denver, Colorado, named Carter Douglas, noticed the absence of an employee. The employee, a man named Al Kite, was a warm and friendly guy who was normally a beacon of responsibility. He was rarely late, if ever, let alone without prior warning. When minutes began to turn into hours, the coworkers of Al began to grow worried. They decided to give Al's home and cell phone a shot, hoping he'd pick up and explain his absence on this Monday morning. Multiple calls yielded no results, and the office finally decided to phone Al's emergency contact. His emergency contact was his sister, Barbara, who lived thousands of miles away in Virginia. Barbara answered the call, but insisted that she had not heard from Al or anyone else that morning. So now she began trying to contact her younger brother, trying to reach the same phone numbers that the office had tried beforehand. In desperation, Barbara eventually turned to the one resource that she had, the police. She knew that this absence was very unlike Al, so she got in touch with the Aurora Police Department to pay her brother a visit and perform a welfare check. Later that afternoon, Aurora police responded to Al Kite's residence. It was a residential townhouse, which didn't look too abnormal. They knocked at the door multiple times, which earned them no response. Fearing that Al might be in some kind of danger, officers made the decision to enter the home. Inside, these police officers would find things to be pretty normal. Things looked where they should be, with some notable exceptions, but they continued their search of the home into the upstairs bedrooms, eventually deciding to head down to the basement to check there. Down there, in the basement, these officers would make a horrifying discovery unlike any other. This is the story of Oakey Al Kite. Welcome to Unresolved. I'm your host, Micheal Whelan. This episode bears a lot of similarities to the last story that I covered, that of Seattle realtor Mike Emmert. So please be warned that this is an extremely creepy story, and if you are averse to physical violence, or don't like hearing any disturbing details, then this one might not be for you. However, if you do want to continue listening, make sure to help support the podcast. You could show your support by either heading to patreon.com/unresolvedpod, where you can help financially support the show and get access to bonus episodes. Or you can make a one-time donation through PayPal by using the podcast email address, theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com. However, if Patreon and PayPal are not for you, then you can also show your support for the podcast in other ways. Either by heading to iTunes or Apple Podcasts to leave a 5-star rating and a review, or by simply spreading the word to any friends or family that might be interested in listening. Whether you help financially support the podcast or simply retweet our social media post, thank you for listening and for supporting Unresolved. Now, without any further ado, let's head back in time and learn a bit more about the man behind today's episode. Oakey Albert Kite Jr. was born on May 7th, 1951, in Nash County, North Carolina. His parents, Oakey Albert Kite Sr. and Edith Davis Kite, had one other child, a daughter named Barbara. Growing up, Oakey Jr. began going by the nickname of Al, probably trying to differentiate himself from his father. Oakey Kite Sr. was a well-renowned dog trainer in the area, who was also a co-founder and partner in a North Carolina dog training company called Oakey and Hunter Grove. Al's mother, Edith, actually passed away pretty early in his life. She was only 48 years old when she died, in January of 1970, and Al was only 18. Despite that, Al went on to be a very well-adjusted young man. He had grown up in Halifax County, North Carolina, an area known primarily for tobacco and cotton farming. He attended Weldon High School, in the town of the same name, where he would befriend a young woman named Gail Kay. The two would remain friends for the next couple of years, while Al went away to school. For college, Al did not go far. He went about an hour south, to Wilson, North Carolina. There, he attended Atlantic Christian College, where he majored in business administration. In 1971, Al began working for Stone & Webster, a large engineering services company. He would end up working for this company for over 31 years, in some form or another, in a variety of jobs that took him throughout the United States. He began his Stone & Webster employment by working at the Surrey nuclear plant. about an hour and a half southeast of Richmond, Virginia. There, he started out as a timekeeper before being promoted to an accountant. Eventually, he would become the head of a department. In 1976, Al would marry his high school friend, Gail. In the interim handful of years, she had been in and out of a relationship, but the timing was just right for them to reunite. She brought with her a daughter named Julie, who would become Al's stepdaughter. Even when Al and Gail divorced over a decade later, Julie and he would remain close. Al's job took him all over the United States. In fact, even the world. He spent time as a project accountant for positions in Massachusetts, Texas, New York, Nevada, Wyoming, and Tennessee. In fact, he even spent a short period of time as a senior timekeeper on a project in the North African country of Algeria. As I already hinted at, Al and Gail would divorce in 1988. Their separation seemed to be amicable, as Al carried on a loving relationship with his stepdaughter. But it was at this point that Al became a bachelor. In the early 1990s, Al became a manager of accounting procedures in California, which meant that he took on the task of working on finances for multiple projects. This included the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories, San Francisco's International Airport, and the Bay Area Rapid Transit. It wasn't until 1998 that the proposition of moving to Colorado surfaced. Al was given the opportunity to accept a job there, and since he enjoyed doing all kinds of outdoor activities, such as golfing, biking, hiking, camping, and skiing, he jumped at this opportunity. Al Kite moved to Aurora, Colorado, an area on the outskirts of Denver's metropolitan area. Al bought a property in Aurora along South Helena Street. The home, which is roughly halfway between Cherry Creek State Park and Buckley Air Force Base, is just a stone's throw away from Interstate 225. The house itself was a two-story townhouse, which had a lot of room inside. Al often joked that it was more room than he needed, especially as a middle-aged bachelor that liked to spend lots of his free time outside. At some point in the early 2000s, he decided to turn the finished basement into a standalone apartment. Doing so would allow him to help pay the mortgage, while also filling up some space that he was not using. This came in handy in 2002, when Al's parent company, Stone & Webster, decided to downsize. Al was let go, but was able to obtain employment again just a short time later, when he began working for Carter Douglas, a consulting firm. For the next couple of years, his life proceeded in a casual way. He had very few commitments, and he was able to spend his time as he saw fit. He got in plenty of golfing, hiking, and skiing, and made full use of the area's climate to accommodate his outdoor activities. At work, he became known as a comforting, helpful presence that was always willing to go the extra mile for anyone that needed his help. Al's warm, welcoming smile became a common sight among not only his friends and relatives, but among his co-workers. It wasn't until 2004 that things in Al's life began to really change. First and foremost, he began dating a woman named Linda Angelopoulos. The two seemed to hit it off really well, and while the two played it pretty casually for a month or two, they started to float the idea of making it a more serious thing moving forward. Also, earlier in 2004, the tenant that had been renting out Al's basement apartment for a couple of years told him that they were planning to move out in a few months' time. As such, they would not be renewing their lease. This tenant did move out in May of 2004, and Al began making plans to find another tenant. He put an advertisement in the local papers shortly thereafter, and he would receive a couple of interested parties, but one in particular who seemed more interested than the others. One man responded to Al's advertisements for a roommate on May 19, 2004. This man, who identified himself as Robert, wanted to move in almost immediately. He was willing to provide Al with a security deposit and the first month's rent in order to make it happen quickly. Al told his girlfriend, Linda, about this potential tenant. Al stated that this man had just moved from the East Coast, and that he had taken a job at a nearby Wells Fargo, in an unknown capacity, and was temporarily staying at the home of his sister, hence why he now needed a place of his own. Al's girlfriend, Linda Angelopoulos, never saw this potential tenant's face. She later stated that the only time they were nearby one another, she had to duck in to use the restroom, and in the minute or two that she was in there, this mysterious man, who went by the name of Robert Cooper, found an excuse to leave. In her words, quote, "He did not want me to see him at all." Despite Linda being unable to get a look at this mysterious tenant's face, she was able to describe the kind of clothing that he was wearing. She said that he dressed very well, wearing a nice pair of pants and a suit coat. In addition to details that she witnessed and or gained from conversations with her boyfriend, Al. This mystery man was described as being in his mid-40s. He had dark wavy hair. He stood about 5 feet 8 inches tall, and he weighed around 180 pounds. Also, most uniquely, he walked with a noticeable limp. Likewise, he carried a cane to stabilize his walking. Linda gained most of this information in a brief glance of the mysterious man, as she exited the bathroom and looked out the window to see his profile walking away from her. She later said, quote, "I just saw him for an instant." In addition to Linda's lone sighting of this man, there were a group of unrelated witnesses that recall either seeing or even encountering the man named Robert Cooper. A local professor from the University of Colorado owned a property that she was renting out. A man matching the exact same physical description of this Robert Cooper met with her to discuss the property. However, this man did not have a limp, nor did he carry a cane. In fact, he even spoke to her with a Romanian accent. And before you ask, I wondered this myself. Apparently, this professor was pretty familiar with Eastern European languages, and could easily differentiate between different dialects, such as Hungarian and Romanian. This man had apparently approached several potential renters in the days and weeks leading up to him responding to Al Kite's advertisement. At least 3 of these renters recall having encounters with this mysterious man, and uniquely, all recall him having different characteristics. He had different accents, mannerisms, etc. It was as if he was putting different personas on display, and was playing a new character for each potential witness. One of these potential renters described this man as being in his mid-30s, while another described him in his early 50s, just to give you an idea of the range being displayed by this man. In one case, a cane and a limp was present, whereas in another, he walked totally fine, without any needed assistance. In some cases, he had an accent, but in others, he spoke very sparsely and said little in a quiet American voice. One of the renters, an older woman, recalled getting creeped out by the way that this strange man moved throughout her home. She said that he seemed to examine the windows very thoroughly, but said very little. After just a moment, she recalled getting an odd feeling from the man, and his very presence began to make her feel uneasy. This is right around the time that Robert Cooper responded to Al Kite's advertisement, in May of 2004. One of Al's neighbors recalls seeing this man leave Al's home on May 19th, so police pinned that down as the first time that he made contact with Al. Over the next day or two, at least 2 of Al's neighbors recall having odd encounters with the man. A male neighbor tried to approach this Robert Cooper, but was completely and utterly ignored. In another case, a female neighbor said that she encountered this man on a nearby walking trail, but recalled him seeming to stare through her without talking. She also said that when she encountered the man, he was walking without a limp. At the time that these strange incidents were taking place, hardworking Al Kite was totally unaware. Just a day or two after meeting Al Kite, the two reached an agreement. In addition to paying a security deposit, this man, named Robert Cooper, would provide half of the first month's rent and would begin moving in the very next week. On the morning of Saturday, May 22nd, Al drove his girlfriend, Linda, to the airport. She was leaving on a week-long trip, and made plans to call him when she arrived at her destination. Sure enough, at around 3:30 p.m., she landed and gave Al a call. She told him that she had just landed, and Al seemed to be in a good mood on the other end. He told Linda that he had just fixed a pipe in the basement, along with a neighbor, and seemed to be having a productive Saturday. They soon wished each other a nice weekend and said goodbye. That would be the last time that anyone knowingly spoke to Oakey Al Kite. It was 2 days later, Monday, May 24th, that Al's absence was noted at work. His employer then contacted his sister, who got in touch with Aurora PD and arranged for a welfare check to be performed on Oakey Kite. Police entered the home after receiving no response to their repeated knocking attempts. They performed a cursory glance around the home and then began stepping into the basement, where Al's mysterious new roommate was going to be moving in any day now. Down in the basement, these responding officers found the body of Al Kite lying face down in a crime scene that looked incredibly gruesome from the get-go. There was blood spatter located along the wall and the floor around his body, indicating that his death had definitely not been a peaceful one. Detective Thomas Sobieski of the Aurora Police Department responded to the call and would become the lead investigator for the case. He later described the crime scene as, quote, the worst he'd ever seen. Investigators made note of a wound on the back of Al's head, which indicated that he had been hit from behind. Most likely, they theorized, this had happened when he was walking down the basement steps. Most disturbing, though, was the realization that this poor man had not died painlessly, or even quickly. Police soon discovered that Al had been bound with a cord, not only his hands behind his back, but his feet as well, which were then tied to the wrist ligatures. He had, in essence, been hogtied, and from there, the person that had attacked Al Kite had proceeded to mercilessly torture him for hours, at the very least, using a number of sharp instruments to do so. Based on the information that investigators could surmise from the gruesome scene, they theorized that when relief came for Al Kite, it came in the form of 22 stab wounds. He appeared to have died just hours after speaking to his girlfriend, Linda, on the evening of Saturday, May 22nd, 2004. It was unknown if the killer had been invited in or somehow broken, but investigators theorized that the killer had struck when Al Kite was walking down to the basement. Public statements from Detective Sobieski and Al's loved ones seemed to indicate that earlier in the week, when Al was talking to his mysterious new tenant, they had made mention of a recliner in the living room, which Al wanted to move down to the basement. The two had spoken about it being unable to fit through the stairwell, and it was theorized that, perhaps, Al was living up to his kind reputation by helping his new tenant move a reclining chair downstairs for his comfort, when Al's very nature was betrayed by this unknown subject. Due to some evidence that Detective Sobieski and other investigators were able to find, it appeared that, following the brutal torture and murder of Oakey Al Kite, the killer had then proceeded to eat food from Al's kitchen, took a shower in the master bathroom, slept in Al's bed, and even wore articles of Al's clothing. A statement from a neighbor seemed to indicate that this mysterious killer left early Sunday morning, but not before conducting a thorough cleaning of Al's home. The house had seemingly been wiped down for fingerprints, and bleach had been poured down the shower drain to destroy any of the killer's forensic evidence. In addition, the killer had soaked multiple knives in bleach afterwards. When police arrived at the crime scene and discovered Al's body in the basement, they made note of several items in the kitchen sink. The drain had been plugged, and in the sink were anywhere between 6 and 12 knives, as well as a number of household items, including a drinking glass, a pen, a dishwashing scrubber, and Al's car keys. The sink had then been filled with Clorox bleach. Immediately, investigators began working on a motive for the crime. Originally, it had seemed to be a crime of passion, only because Al had been physically tormented before his death. But there was no one in Al's life who had a reason to pick a fight with him, let alone torture him for hours on end. They then began to develop a theory that this was a methodically planned robbery, as police would soon learn that a couple of Al's items seemed to be missing from his home, namely his vehicle and his cell phone. As police began orchestrating a search for those items, they hoped that they would be able to latch onto the killer's path soon enough. Later in the day, on Monday, May 24th, Al Kite's blue and gray GMC pickup truck was found. The vehicle had been parked a little over a block and a half away from Al's home, along the street. As investigators conducted a search of the vehicle, hoping to uncover some forensic evidence of the killer, they also began a thorough search of Al's home. They were able to find trace amounts of DNA, presumably left behind by the killer, and that would be submitted to a forensic database shortly thereafter. While looking through the garbage can in Al's kitchen, investigators found a discarded rental application. This application, which looked to have been handwritten by the mysterious tenant moving into Al's basement, contained this stranger's name, mailing address, social security number, and phone number. The name on the rental application read Robert Cooper. It is believed that was a fake name. The address, which was supposed to belong to the sister of this Robert Cooper, was actually a building on the campus of the University of Colorado's medical school. The social security number, when looked up, turned out to belong to an unrelated woman who had no connection to this case. And then there's the phone number on the rental application, which was an active phone number. However, the phone did not belong to any phone line. It was a burner phone, the prepaid kind that you could find at a convenience store. When police organized a trace of this phone, as well as Al Kite's cell phone, they were surprised to find both of them moving through the Denver area. A search was able to find both of the cell phones. However, neither of them were in the hands of this unknown killer. Police would soon learn that both phones, the burner phone belonging to this mysterious Robert Cooper and Al Kite's cell phone, had been abandoned in the Five Points area of Denver, Colorado. In particular, they had been left behind in an area where the homeless often hung around. Presumably, the killer knew that these phones would be picked up and used by unknown transients. A further investigation into the burner phone used by this Robert Cooper determined that the phone had been purchased nearby the University of Colorado Medical School, which was now a second connection to this campus. Detectives were also able to learn that this phone had been used on several rental applications and had been used by the suspect to make dozens of outgoing calls to potential renters. This tentative connection to the nearby University of Colorado Medical School would become one of the very few leads that investigators had to work with. In addition to the mailing address on Robert Cooper's rental application bearing a school building, there was now a burner phone being purchased just off of the campus itself. Also, as police would later learn, some of the rental properties that this mysterious Robert Cooper applied to had been advertised exclusively on flyers within the University of Colorado library. They had not been posted anywhere else, not on the internet, not in newspaper ads, etc. Despite this lead, which potentially connected the murder of Al Kite to the nearby U of C medical campus, police would soon have their hands full investigating another urgent matter. A quick check of Al Kite's financial history showed that his credit cards had been used quote-unquote substantially after his supposed time of death. But his ATM card had also been used on the night of his murder, Saturday, May 22nd, when they discovered Al's GMC pickup truck, parked roughly a block and a half away from his home. They found ATM receipts on the front seat. Investigators were able to track down the specific ATM that the card had been used on at a nearby Wells Fargo. This ATM had a built-in camera and was able to give police a glance at the killer. Obscured by a ski mask, the killer had been driving Al's GMC pickup truck when he made the withdrawal from this ATM. Only a small portion of his face can be seen, including his eyes, the bridge of what looks to be a long nose, and a small portion of his upper cheeks. Unfortunately, the killer had also been wearing gloves when he visited the ATM, so police were unable to find any kind of fingerprints on the machine or in the truck itself. One of the things that made police disregard this case as a robbery is that, while at the ATM, the killer withdrew, quote, an even $1,000. However, Al Kite had much more than $1,000 in his bank account, and the killer had access to all of it throughout that weekend. Despite that though, they only made this one stop, and decided to withdraw no more than $1,000. It is believed that, after visiting this ATM, the killer then drove Al's vehicle to the street it was later found on, leaving the ATM receipt on the seat next to him. He then took the keys back to Al's home, where they were soaked in bleach, along with an assortment of knives and other household items. Within days of the murder, the potential motive of robbery was discarded, due to a couple of pretty pronounced reasons. Namely, that the killer could have withdrawn more at the ATM than they did. But police also noticed that nothing of value seemed to be missing from the home of Oakey, Al Kite. In addition, investigators did not believe that the torture of Al had been done to obtain any information, such as the PIN number for his bank account. Police, after speaking to Al's loved ones, determined that he would have given any thief the information that they needed, thus making the torture excessive and gratuitous. Linda, Al's girlfriend, said, quote, "If somebody would have said, 'Give me all of your money,' he'd ask why, but he'd give it to you." This information seemed to paint a terrifying and bone-chilling explanation for the death of Al Kite, that the killer had planned everything out in advance, and had likely committed the heinous crime for the mere sake of murdering someone. Barbara Hannah, Al's sister, said about the killer, quote, "It's so hard to imagine why it was done. This guy was doing it for the thrill. He just wanted to find people to kill. He brought his own little torturing kit. He knew he had all the time in the world." Police believed that the killer had targeted Al because he lived alone, and did not have many friends or family in the area. And, because of his kind and compassionate nature, he was probably easy to take advantage of. This was confirmed by Al's sister, who stated that Al was, quote, "very compassionate, very trusting, which may have led to his death. He had a goodness about him." Al's killer had likely come prepared to murder the man, and had taken precautionary steps to leave very little trace of himself. He had planted seeds of confusion, which led to the investigation struggling to keep track of the various threads, such as withdrawing only $1,000 from the ATM, planting the cell phones in a hotspot for the homeless, etc. Because of all of this planning, police theorized that the killer had likely killed before. The methods used in this violent crime indicated that he might have been some kind of methodical serial killer. In fact, many online commenters have pointed to this man coming across as a Keyser Söze-esque villain, a fictional character that was able to change his mannerisms at will. However, unlike Keyser Söze, this man did leave behind some evidence at the crime scene. Police were able to discover fingerprints and a small amount of DNA, which they used years later to create a digital image. Following the murder of Al Kite, police put together a list of characteristics that may have been exhibited by his killer. The following may or may not be true, but became connected to the case in one way or another. The killer may have been from the East Coast, in particular from the area of or around New Jersey. He may have had some connection to the banking industry, specifically working for Wells Fargo. He may have been familiar with the University of Colorado Hospital in Denver, Colorado. He likely dressed professionally on a regular basis. He may or may not have had a mother, sister, or other female relative that lived in the Aurora area. And finally, he may have, at one point, attempted to become a police officer. Investigators theorized that this kind of behavior, violent crime followed up with mind games perpetrated against the police, may have come from a denial or failure to become a police officer. Based on some neighbor sightings, and the pictures taken from the Wells Fargo ATM that the killer visited, a composite drawing was made. You can find this image online. It is believed that the killer stood about 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighed around 175 pounds, and had wavy, dark hair. He is believed to be in his mid-40s, but again, it is believed that he could have been younger or slightly older than that. Some witnesses recall him being in his late 20s or early 30s, while others described him as being in his early 50s. While investigators struggled to figure out what had happened to Al, his family and friends struggled to deal with his loss. Later that month, in May, his remains were released to the custody of his loved ones, and they were flown back east to his hometown of Halifax, North Carolina. Funeral services took place on June 2nd, 2004, commencing at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Overseen by Reverend Stan Lewis, Al was memorialized and remembered by those that knew him best. His sister, Barbara, and her family. His girlfriend, Linda. His stepdaughter, Julie. And a number of friends and other relatives. Later that day, Oakey Al Kite was buried in the church cemetery, where he rests to this day. There have been a number of theories and related cases that have cropped up over the years, but almost all of them tie into some possible connection to this case. These include 3 specific avenues that investigators and police have looked into. The first is that this case has some kind of connection to the work that Al was involved in, as a lead accountant and department head for many large engineering projects, such as the Surrey nuclear plant in North Carolina, or the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories in California. The second is that this crime has some connection to the real estate market, considering that Al had just put his basement apartment up for rent, and this crime may or may not bear a resemblance to another crime I just covered on Unresolved. The third, and potentially most terrifying of the possibilities, is that this may have been a practice kill, in which a contract killer or a burgeoning serial killer decided to make Al Kite a victim for no apparent reason. Tied into that is also the possibility that this might have just been a senseless act of violence. For each of these possibilities, I'll share with you one related story to help explain why investigators have looked at these avenues, and why these 3 avenues are so often linked to the story of Oakey Al Kite. Lee Scott Hall was an employee of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and he happened to work at the facility throughout the 1990s, at the same time as Al Kite. Lee Hall lived a very private life. He had been married twice, but was long divorced by the time he began working for the California-based institute. His 2 marriages had resulted in just 1 child, a son who had already reached adulthood. But employees of the National Lab had no idea. They say that Lee Scott Hall kept to himself, and focused almost exclusively on work when he was there. Records showed that throughout 1999, he had made no phone calls and had no personal emails sent from his accounts. In fact, despite remaining slightly active at a golf course nearby his home, where he kept a 10 handicap, he was an incredibly private individual. In addition to having no outgoing phone calls or personal emails, he had in fact been ducking phone calls from his son, Micheal, a real estate developer that lived in Portland, Oregon. In 1998, Lee Hall was part of a team that discovered a flaw with the project that he was working on. He worked as a lead designer for the National Ignition Facility, a very large-scale project whose stated purpose was to achieve nuclear fusion. The flaw, which Lee Hall and his team discovered, was a 5-degree difference regarding a laser's alignment. Mind you, when I mention a laser, it goes without saying that this facility dealt with some of the largest and most expensive lasers in the entire world. Overall, this was a project that cost upwards of $1.2 billion, so any fixes, no matter how big or small, could easily cost somewhere in the millions of dollars. By the following year, the project was 5 years late and approximately $350 million over budget. So, of course, with Energy Secretary Bill Richardson demanding results, the recommendation by Hall's team fell on deaf ears, and the project proceeded as planned. But in September of that year, 1999, the fix proposed by Lee Scott Hall and his team moved up the ranks, and was quickly approved. The cost to fix the issue was estimated to be around $1 million. Coincidentally, around the same time, Lee Scott Hall received a pay raise that was quote-unquote substantial, according to one news report. About a month later, on Wednesday, October 20th, 1999, Lee Hall failed to show up for work. Some fellow co-workers decided to pay him a visit to make sure that he was okay, and they drove to his house. When they got there, they found his front door unlocked. And, most unusually, the side gate on his house had been left wide open. You see, Lee was a very attentive person, and had to make sure that everything in his home was neat, tidy, and working efficiently. And that included the front door and the side gates. Hall's co-workers entered into his home, and they were surprised to find that his glasses had been left in the kitchen. In addition, the TV in the living room had been left on. They scoped out the rest of his home, eventually finding Lee's body lying face down on his bedroom floor. They originally thought that he might have just fallen and hit his head on a nearby nightstand, but a closer examination revealed a particularly gruesome crime scene. The subsequent investigation showed that Lee Scott Hall had been brutally beaten and stabbed. He had been hit once in the right temple, a blow that might have knocked him unconscious. His face contained an odd scratch, which indicated the killer had worn abrasive gloves or had some kind of ring on a finger. Another strike from the assailant had broken Hall's Adam's apple, and he was then stabbed 10 times. One kidney and his liver were perforated, and his heart was allegedly nearly severed. The scene, Lee Hall's house, showed no signs of a struggle. The bedroom was not disturbed, as was the rest of the home. It all seemed normal. In fact, Hall's toxicology reports indicated that he had consumed alcohol earlier in the evening. This led investigators to theorize that the killer might have been someone he knew or visited with. But because he lived such a private life, tracking down this person proved damn near impossible. A neighbor told police that they had heard gravel moving on the side of Hall's home, a sound similar to crunching under moving car tires, somewhere in the vicinity of 1 a.m. on October 18th. This became Hall's approximate time of death. In a striking similarity to the murder of Al Kite, which took place 5 years after this, Hall's vehicle, a 1992 Acura Vigor, was found about a block away from Hall's home. The car, which was usually parked in Hall's garage, proved an intriguing clue for investigators, as Hall's wallet was found inside the car, with none of his items having been stolen. However, the keys to the car were never recovered. The death of Lee Scott Hall remains a mystery. Because he led such a private life, it was tough for investigators to create any strong suspects. And because nothing of value was stolen from Hall's home, robbery was eliminated as a motive almost entirely. This seemed personal, or perhaps professional. In the aftermath of Hall's death, employees of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories seemed to withhold information from investigators. At the time, they were under an increasing amount of pressure from the Energy Department, and Energy Secretary Bill Richardson had ordered a full-scale investigation into the project's delays and the administration of the project's funding. To investigators, this provided a possible motive for the killer. After all, Hall had just received a substantial pay raise at around the same time that $1 million fix was proposed by his department, and some might have taken that the wrong way. Detective Charlie Garrison, who handled the case and tried to question laboratory employees, stated, quote, "We're not skeptical, but on the other hand we're told that he discovers a major problem that he had tried to bring forth for a year, and it wasn't until a month before his death they said, hey, we do have a problem." The murder of Lee Scott Hall remains unsolved, but some consider it a possible lead into the death of Oakey Kite. They both worked for the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory at the same time. Both died in their own homes, due to causes that seemed excessively brutal. The killers stole very little from each, and parked their cars about a block or so away from the crime scenes. And in both cases, the killer has never been found, let alone identified. Another similar case is one that I covered just recently on this podcast, that of real estate agent Mike Emmert. Mike Emmert was a 40-year-old real estate agent that worked in Kirkland, Washington, an area just north of Seattle. On January 4th, 2001, he met a client in a parking lot, and the two drove to an isolated home in the nearby suburb of Woodinville. There, Mike Emmert was brutally beaten and stabbed by an unknown attacker. DNA testing would later pinpoint a potential killer, a former police officer turned bank robber and career criminal named Gary Kruger. However, Kruger had died after a failed home invasion in 2010, and was never able to be questioned or interrogated, so Mike Emmert's case remains unsolved. In both cases, a real estate dealing provides the background, and the very little information provided about the potential client or tenant points to a similar suspect. In both the murder of Al Kite and the murder of Mike Emmert, the man they were dealing with was described as being in his mid-40s or early 50s, who walked with a limp and carried a cane. In both attacks, the victims were struck from behind, and then brutally beaten and stabbed to death. Then, the killer had proceeded to thoroughly eliminate almost all of their trace evidence from the crime scene. In addition, both crimes saw the killer drive the victim's vehicle to a third location, and, most unusually, they left the victim's personal belongings in strange locations. In the case of Mike Emmert, his cell phone and his wallet were found in strange public locations. Meanwhile, in Al Kite's case, his cell phone was stolen and then abandoned in an area of Denver populated by the homeless. And, for what it's worth, both crimes seem to be methodically planned out by their attacker. The killers had managed to avoid being seen by eyewitnesses, and were described as both odd and weird by those that had briefly run into them. Despite this, though, Aurora detective Thomas Sobieski, who handled the investigation into Al Kite's murder, has told interested parties that he investigated this lead shortly after Al's death in 2004. He has stated that he got in touch with the King County investigators that handled Mike Emmert's case, and together they discussed the similar and different avenues of their separate investigations, in the hopes of finding something. Detective Sobieski has stated that, due to evidence which has not been revealed to the public, that he has a strong reason to believe that the crimes are not related. I am personally more than willing to take his word for it. There are aspects of this case which are unlikely to ever see the light of day, and police want to hold on to those details to make sure that any potential confessions bear truth. However, despite Detective Sobieski's comments, many still question whether or not the crimes might be related. The third, and perhaps most terrifying possibility, is that there was no rhyme or reason to the murder of Oakey Al Kite, that he was targeted by someone, for the mere sake of perpetrating violence upon someone that did not have a very active social circle, that by merely being kind and generous, he was deemed an easy target by a wandering predator. Police found it unlikely that the killer had zeroed in on Al Kite from the get-go. Based on their movements in the weeks before Al's murder, it seemed like they were judging different apartments, houses, and landlords. They were scoping out potential victims and grading them on a number of attributes. Since Al lived alone, his girlfriend was gone for a week, and he had a big house to himself. The killer likely picked him out as a target and then decided to strike then. It is possible that a candidate for this terrifying murder is none other than a wandering psychopath that I have covered on this podcast before, Israel Keyes. In case you have not listened to that episode of Unresolved, I'll give you a very brief summary on Israel Keyes. Starting sometime in the early 2000s, perhaps even earlier than that, Keyes began weaving a crime spree that federal investigators have yet to untangle. He traveled throughout the country, oftentimes flying into one airport, getting a rental car, and then driving thousands of miles out of the way in order to commit heinous murders against unwitting victims. Israel Keyes idolized Ted Bundy, and, just like Bundy, he portrayed himself as a charming, happy-go-lucky everyman, who appealed himself to everyone in his social circle. Keyes didn't pop up on the radar of authorities until he made an impulsive decision to abduct, rape, and brutally murder a young woman named Samantha Koenig in Anchorage, Alaska. This was in February of 2012. After this incident, police were able to determine that Keyes was the man responsible for the murder of this young woman, and he was then arrested in March of that year. While detained, Keyes partially confessed to committing many murders over a decade-long span of time, stating that he had victims all over the country, ranging from his home of Washington State, to New York, to Vermont, etc. He was also linked to a series of bank robberies in the Northeast, and home invasions from various spots around the US. For almost all of the crimes committed by Israel Keyes, he had no identifiable motive. His crimes were random, and he often used disguises and various bits of misdirection to mislead investigators. He would pay for trips in cash, to leave no paper trail, and would often turn off his cell phone to avoid pinging any radio towers. When Al Kite was murdered in Aurora, Colorado, Israel Keyes was 26 years old, which makes him pretty young to be the mysterious Robert Cooper. However, when we factor in the possibility of Keyes using some kind of disguise and gimmick to make himself look older, it's possible that we end up with a much wider age range. In fact, many who view the ATM footage of Al Kite's killer see a striking resemblance to Israel Keyes, which is hard to look past. And some might say that the fact that the DNA and the fingerprints haven't matched up with Israel Keyes is a determining factor to say that he wasn't Robert Cooper. However, we do know that Israel Keyes loved to use fake DNA and plant evidence to mislead investigators, so I don't know, it's hard to tell. Unfortunately, Israel Keyes committed suicide while in police custody. When he killed himself in December of 2012, he took his own secrets to the grave, and many investigators have been struggling to determine all of the crimes committed by Israel Keyes in the years since. Despite there being many promising angles for investigators to look into, the lack of any real evidence has brickwalled them at every turn. A few years ago, in fact, they were forced to change the case status of Kite's murder from unsolved to unresolved. However, detectives remain positive that they will be able to find and prosecute whoever committed this particularly heinous crime. Hopefully, even sometime soon. In June of 2017, my friend Nina Instead of the Already Gone podcast put out an episode about Kite and his murder, and that helped attract a lot of much needed attention to the investigation. By no surprise, just a few months later, in December of 2017, police announced that they had used DNA found at the crime scene to update the description of their suspect. The DNA, which police believed belonged to the killer, was used to create a new genetic-based image. This image was created by Virginia-based Parabon Nanolabs and used quote-unquote DNA phenotyping to create this new digital composite. It brought new life to a case which had been cold for over 13 years. Anyone with information is encouraged to reach out to Detective Thomas Sobieski of the Aurora Police Department, whose phone number is 303-739-6710. As of this episode's recording, the story of Oakey Kite remains unresolved. Thank you for listening to Unresolved. If you would like to keep in touch with the podcast, you can reach out in a variety of ways. The podcast can be found on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. On all three, you can just search for Unresolved Pod, and the podcast should pop up for you. Make sure to join the Facebook discussion group as well, so you could find illuminating content, like my alcohol-induced AMA from last weekend. That was fun. Any emails you may have can be sent in to theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com, or into my personal email, michael@unresolved.me. And as always, my name is spelled the weird way, with the E before the A. And yes, I promise it was spelled that way intentionally. If you want to call in and leave a voicemail, or send in a text message, the podcast phone line is 831-200-3550. Also, if you enjoy listening to Unresolved and just cannot get enough of my voice, make sure to check out my other podcast, Hoax. I had to take a little bit of time off to focus on Unresolved and some stories I was working on, but I just considered that time off to be my quote-unquote mid-season break, like I'm Breaking Bad or The Walking Dead or something like that. That podcast will be back soon, and let me tell you, some of the episodes I'm working on are doozies. Once again, that podcast name is Hoax. Check it out and subscribe if you haven't already. And before I go, I just want to give a quick thank you to everyone that's supported the podcast for so long. It is so appreciated, and I seriously cannot thank all of you enough. But that's enough from me for today. I'll be back soon enough, and I'll talk to you all later. Take care.